Crick, the world's leading expert on DNA, came to the conclusion that DNA could not have evolved on this planet.
Can I offer you a crazy theory, and you can tell me if I'm nuts?
Okay.
So in 1973, Francis Crick, who discovered the double helical structure of DNA, wrote a paper about directed panspermia.
Won a Nobel Prize.
Won a Nobel Prize, renowned scientist. He wrote a paper on directed panspermia.
Indeed, he did. He wrote a book, actually, called Life Itself. He wrote papers and a book.
Interesting. I didn't even know that.
The book is a tough read. It was published in 1981.
Okay.
But it's fascinating. And if I can just jump the gun a bit,
yeah, do it. You probably know what I'm going to ask. Yeah.
That Crick, the world's leading expert on DNA, came to the conclusion that DNA could not have evolved on this planet in the time available for it. You know, the classic model is that we have a sort of primeval soup. The early Earth, the Earth forms about 4.5 billion years ago, 4,500 million years ago. And for the first 600 million years, it's too hot to support any life. Until about 3.9 billion years ago, it gets to the stage where it could support very basic life forms. And within 100 million years of that, which across a span of billions of years is a tiny amount of time, within 100 million years of that, by 3.8 billion years ago, bacterial life was all over this planet. And Crick's view was, as a leading scientist whose whole life was focused on the study of DNA, his life was that DNA could not have emerged accidentally from the primeval soup on this planet in just 100 million years. It needed much longer he still bought into the primeval soup idea, but not on this planet.
Yes.
What he came down to was that there must have been some other planet, somewhere else, where a primeval soup had existed, and there had been enough time for DNA to emerge from the accidental bumping together of molecules. That's, by the way, something I'm a bit skeptical of anywhere, but nevertheless, that was Crick's point in Life Itself. And then he suggested that, you know, the universe is very old, at least 13.5 billion years old. There's time for life to have evolved elsewhere in the universe. And he suggested that what happened was that the first primitive bacteria continued to evolve on that distant planet, orbiting another sun on the other side of the universe, that life began to evolve, and eventually a highly developed civilization emerged on that planet. I'm not saying they looked anything like us. And by the way, I need to emphasize this is Crick. This is not me who's saying this. This is the Nobel Prize winner who's saying this. That life evolved on that planet, highly intelligent, sophisticated, advanced life form. And then they discovered that they faced certain doom, that there was going to be, he suggested, a supernova going off in their vicinity, which would strip their planet of all life. And to continue the Crick story, he then said, well, the first thing they would have done was to figure, could we get ourselves off the planet? Could we go colonize another planet? But the distances in interstellar space were too great for that to be feasible. So they did the next best thing. They genetically engineered bacteria. They incorporated the DNA code within those bacteria. And then they put the bacteria into cryogenic chambers in spaceships and fired them off in all directions.
Put some algae and CO2 for food, and then
you know, and we know that bacteria, extremophiles, can survive in extremely dire circumstances, and fired them off into the early universe. And to cut a long story short, 3.9 billion years ago, one of those spaceships collided with the early Earth, spilled out its contents of bacteria, and there you have it. Life begins to evolve on this planet, and it contains the DNA code that came from another planet.
And fungal DNA is more similar to human DNA than plant DNA.
It's fascinating,
which
isn't
is
it?
pretty amazing.
Fungi are amazing things, which are kind of halfway between the animal and the plant world. They're the most curious and incredible things. So that was Crick's suggestion, and I don't think it's a wild suggestion. Particularly bearing in mind who it comes from. God, he stuck his neck out in proposing something like that. You know, because there's a huge lobby behind the natural selection and the Darwinian model.
Sure.
He wasn't stepping away from the Darwinian model, but he was trying to solve an anomaly. He couldn't understand how DNA could have formed accidentally in just 100 million years.
Well, it almost feels like human evolution. There are gaps in human evolution, and evolutionary biologists like to say they have these placeholder words like punctuated equilibria.
Yes,
but
that's right.
if you really look at, I think like the stoned ape theory, for example, the doubling in cranial size between 2 million years ago and 300,000 years ago, and then the emergence of culture, which you and Brian Murarescu talk about. A possible explanation for the emergence of culture, which I want to get your take on, is a lot of people say specialization and culture inevitably comes from having more time because you have agriculture.
That's right.
You have talked about sort of a transfer of technology, maybe from an antecedent civilization. What if you're planting wheat, barley, and rye? Those were like the original sort of things in the agricultural revolution. Ergot grows on those things.
It does, naturally, yeah.
And so what if there is, this, it's almost like the ergot is like a zip
particular
file.
kind of ergots, Claviceps paspali.
Okay.
Some ergots are deadly toxic.
Okay.
But it happens that the one that grows on barley is not toxic, and it is soluble in water. So it can be turned into a brew.
Interesting. So what if the consumption of that is what spurred all these ideas that have sort of created a lot of modern civilization?
Well, that's exactly the case that I made in my 2005 book, Supernatural. And it's exactly the case that Brian's taken much further in his, 2021 book, The Immortality Key. That it was, and somebody else we have to recognize.
Carl Rocker.
No, it's the late, great Terence McKenna.
Oh, yeah, of course.
Terence McKenna was a key thinker in this field. His book, I would recommend to anybody who's listening, his book, Food of the Gods, was one of the first books to suggest that this quantum leap forward in human behavior and in human consciousness was entirely the result of experimenting with psychedelics.
Yeah, and McKenna thinks that he talks about a mushroom trip where the mushrooms say to him, "Within my memory exist the blueprints for hyperlight drives."
Yeah.
I believe that God left certain drugs growing naturally upon our planet to help speed up and facilitate our evolution.
If you think about it, if you have an alien civilization, would you present yourself as a hominid creature, like a foreign invader, hominid creature, or will you subtly merge with the higher hominid creature, affect their thinking, and hitchhike your way to the next planet?
I think you go for subtle merging.
Yeah.
And this is where, again, shamanism has much to teach Western science, because shamans need to be taken seriously when they say that the plants and the fungi are teachers. And that's a very mysterious thing. Anybody who's had deep psychedelic journey will know that they get teachings in that journey. And those teachings generally refer to their own lives and their own behavior and how they behave. It's very odd that a mushroom or a mixture of two plants from the Amazon should cause us to evaluate our behavior and should teach us that maybe we've been doing stuff wrong that we need to adjust and put right in the future.
Yeah.
I myself have had a creative gift from psychedelics, and that was back in 2006. Drinking ayahuasca in Brazil over a series of 5 sessions. I was literally given the entire plot of a novel. I'd never written a novel before.
That's crazy.
But I was given the entire plot of a novel, which I eventually, and at the end of those sessions, I got a very clear message from the entity that I call Mother Ayahuasca. And frankly, I don't care if scientists roll their eyes. If you're going to roll your eyes at the notion of Mother Ayahuasca, go drink some ayahuasca and then see if you're going to roll your eyes.
Right.
I was given the gift of a story, and I was given a very strong instruction: write it.
Did you?
And I did, and I wrote it. It's called Entangled, and it features a young woman 24,000 years ago and a young woman today who are entangled across time in a battle of good against evil. There's a demonic force that is traveling through time and that is twisting humanity out of our true mission, and their job is to stop that force, both in the Stone Age and today.
Do you consider yourself Gnostic, or what would your, because you're not garden variety religious?
I'm not. No,
Yeah.
I don't.
And in many ways, you're anti.
I'm anti. I'm not a Christian. I don't belong to any religion. if I were to put myself in a category, I would say Gnostic is the right category. I wrote a book with Robert Bauval back in the 90s called Talisman. And of course, the Gnostics were amongst the first people to be burnt at the stake when the Roman Catholic Church, as I put it, pulled on the jackboot of the Roman state and began to persecute its competitors.
And you talk about almost in that book a through line of Gnosticism in the form of these sort of small Kabbalistic
I believe it's
units.
continued. I believe it's continued. The message has not just evaporated, but it's gone underground, and it's been transmitted through various lines. And in some cases, those lines may not even know what they're transmitting anymore.
That's interesting.
But, yeah.
So it's like in the past you'd have the Templars, the Rosicrucians, or the Freemasons, and now there's like a hermetic transfer without a real or exoteric organization even existing.
Yes, it can be passed down in that way. I would say Freemasonry is an interesting example. I'm not a Freemason myself. I don't join clubs, and I'm not a member of that club, and I never will be a member of that club. Or
Our
any
friend
other club.
Randall Carlson.
Randall is a Freemason, and I have spoken in Masonic lodges. I've been asked to give lectures, and I've happily done so. I'll give a lecture to anybody who's interested in hearing what I've got to say. Sure. I've spoken several times in Masonic lodges.